1993, El Sereno, East Los Angeles. Blood pools on the street as a member of the Chicano street gang, the Lowell Street Locos, lies dead. Police unfurl yellow crime scene tape while residents watch in fear. The Locos refuse to pay the Mexican Mafia's tax, and now they're fighting for survival. This is an all-out war, David versus Goliath. One gang against all the gangs, each with a green light order to kill on sight. Prepare for hell and high water and plenty of blood as we see who is downright loco enough to go up against the Mexican Mafia in today's episode of the Infographic Show, Gangs Who Defied the Mexican Mafia. First Blood. Long before the deadly war with the Lowell Street Locos, trouble was already brewing inside California's Duell Vocational Institution, or DVI. It was the late 1950s, and DVI was where the worst of California's young offenders were sent. As more Mexican immigrants arrived in California, barrio culture evolved, and traditional rivalries over turf led to the formation of new US-based alliances. Neighborhoods clashed with neighborhoods, and the crazy dudes, the Vatos Locos, made a name for themselves in what a former high-ranking Mexican Mafia member later called an abnormal social value system. In this world, the more ruthless and heartless you were, the stronger your reputation became. It was at DVI where a 16-year-old named Luis Huero Buff Flores had the idea to form an all-Mexican outfit to protect themselves against the other races, namely the powerful black gangs. The idea was to form a brotherhood, or carnales, built on power, loyalty, and absolute control over the drug trade, especially heroin. As one early Mexican Mafia member put it, their goal was to become raging maniacs whose modus operandi was all offense, no defense. Buff put together a ragtag bunch of ruthless guys who soon terrorized the DVI. Most members came from East LA, about 24 of them men from public housing projects like Ramona Gardens and Estrada Courts. Once recruited into the family, they became made men, Imero, a concept fashioned on the Italian-American Mafia, but with less pomp and ceremony and more violence in mind. Known as La M, or the M, members pledged lifetime allegiance. They swore to kill without hesitation. They showed no fear, and if you broke the rules, the punishment was death. New members were soon enlisted, guys like Rodolfo Alvarado, Cheyenne Cadena, who stabbed a young man to death outside a dance hall in 1959 when he was just 16. They were out of control, so in 1961, administrators at DVI said, "Okay, let's see how you guys handle the big boy prison." They sent the gang to San Quentin, with the hope that the adults would beat some sense into them. That didn't happen. They hadn't been there long when a 300-pound black inmate walked up to Cadena in the yard and planted a kiss on his face. The young Mexican, standing at just 5'4", weighing about 120 pounds, returned to the yard soon after and stabbed the man to death with a shiv as about 1,000 inmates looked on. It was clear to everyone that La M meant business. Their reign of terror continued. One of their men, Alfredo Cuate Jimenez, stabbed and killed an inmate in the yard, and the fearless Mike Hatchetison stabbed and killed a man in the gymnasium. Prisoners watched on as these kids covered the landing floors with blood. As new men were sponsored as potential members, the gang kept growing, and the hits kept coming. They took over trafficking operations and extortion rackets. Their ruthless bullying tactics soon started to wear thin on the rest of the prison population. One inmate, Juan Zamilpa, a feared prisoner who had stabbed a snitch to death the year before, finally had enough. He warned that if La M didn't settle down, people would start dying. Zamilpa was highly respected, and the Mexican Mafia knew it. They tried to bring him into the fold, but he refused. Shortly after, he was found dead outside of his cell, stabbed 11 times. A former member from those times, Ramon Mundo Mendoza, said, "We recruited the worst of the worst, people who were willing to kill at the drop of a hat." Now with easily over 30 members, they expanded from drugs and extortion into loan sharking, prostitution, and gambling. And bullying. They never stopped bullying, taking anything they wanted from the other Mexican inmates. La M was about to find itself in a war. First War. Just as La M had formed to protect themselves against other violent inmates and then exploit those inmates, a new Mexican gang was born from the seeds of savagery. This was the Nuestra family, or NF, our family. It started at the California training facility in Soledad. Many of the first members were from LA, but the gang was open to people from all over the state, including many from the rural parts of Northern California. These were men that La M often dismissed as farmeros, or farmers. But it was about to find out NF was a force to be reckoned with. In 1968, the gangs had their first war, the so-called Shoe War, as it was over a stolen pair of shoes. A La M soldier had taken the shoes from the cell of an NF member, and soon the gangs were engaged in a riot in the prison yard. 19 men were injured and 1 man died. This was just the start. The beef would go on for years inside and outside of the prison system, where the American drug war kept both of them in business. After the Shoe War, many of the heavy-duty MA members were transferred to Folsom Prison, where a man named Joe Morgan had already made a name for himself as a tough guy. Morgan was a Slavic-American street kid, but had grown up speaking Spanish in Boyle Heights, East LA. He was a Balkan Sureño, and he was absolutely fearless. With a bald head and a high IQ, he could fight with the best of them, and he usually won. In 1946, he'd beaten a man to death with a hammer, and at just 16, he was introduced to the Californian prison system. By the 1970s, he had risen to become a leading member of La M, with deep drug connections reaching into Mexico. At the time, cocaine hadn't taken over. The real money was in weed and heroin, fueling the drug trade on the mean streets of LA. The coke boom would come later, and when it did, it would change everything. The Godfather. By the time he reached his 40s, Morgan was considered old by La M standards, but his long criminal history, ties to countless murders, and deep drug connections in Mexico had earned him immense respect. He became known as the Godfather. He had another nickname too, Peg Leg, after losing a leg when a gunshot wound turned gangrenous. But if you dared call him that to his face, you would soon be needing a prosthetic head. It was under Morgan when something happened that threatened La M's survival in prison. The highest-ranking members of NF had just allied with a gang known as the Black Guerrilla Family, or BGF. This was a prison and street gang that delved into race politics and, would you believe it, Marxism. They were as at home with a knife and a kilo of smack as they were fluent in talking about the oppression of the black proletariat. This new alliance was trouble, so through Morgan, La M made an alliance of its own. Its partner in crime was another prison gang that had just formed to protect itself from bullying, extortion, and murder. Its name was the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist gang that, like La M, would become known for ultra-violence. It was during this time that California's prisons became deeply divided along racial lines, a division that still exists today. Even now, racial politics in California prisons are far stricter than in most other states. The unwritten rules remain. Don't do business with another race. Don't sit with another race in the chow hall. Don't get too friendly. These rules trace back to the old-timers who first laid down the law. Back then, it wasn't just about racism, it was about tribalism and survival. But one thing was certain, when a riot broke out, you always knew whose side you were on when it came to stabbing a guy. Murders became more common once those lines in the sand were drawn. In 1972 alone, 36 people were killed in prisons in California, most of them from gang violence. The year before, a riot broke out in San Quentin. To this day, it's unclear exactly how things went down. It's said that it all started after George Jackson, a co-founder of the Black Guerrilla Family, had a gun smuggled in by his lawyer. In a subsequent escape attempt, 3 officers were murdered, as were 2 white inmates not affiliated with a prison gang. Jackson himself died when he was shot by an officer. In what became an all-out riot, black gang members fought against La M and alliances fought alliances. It only lasted 33 minutes, but we guess it felt like a long time. It was enough time to send 11 men to the hospital with stab wounds. The men who started it all and survived were treated very harshly, beaten and confined to solitary. In 2015, Hugo Pinell, 71, was beaten to death in a 100-man riot in California State Prison. He had been one of the men back in 71 who'd helped slice the throats of the 3 guards. In the gang world, a grudge can travel through decades and not lose its luster. As you'll see, today's killer is tomorrow's victim, a vicious cycle that never stops. The Godfather Part 2. The violence never stopped, not in prison, and certainly not on the streets. As La M expanded its reach beyond prison walls, it sought to dominate drug distribution and control of South LA street gangs. They were just as ruthless on the outside as they were on the inside. When police found the body of Jimmy Lopez, a man who had stolen heroin from La M, it was clear he had paid the ultimate price. The coroner determined that he had been brutally tortured for 3 hours before he was finally killed. They were executing everyone who got in their way. So when Rodolfo Cadena tried to make a pact with NF in 1971 by calling for a peace summit, some of the more purist elements of La M were offended. Cadena had come to think that the real enemy was the system that oppressed poor brown men. He believed the gangs ought to come together, not fight each other. It seems he was sincere, and this wasn't about a selfish financial move. Still, he was risking breaking rule number 5, a member must not politic or cause dissension within the organization. Pegleg Morgan was said to be furious. To him, the Nuestra family was nothing more than a group of pests. Killing farmers was a hobby he greatly enjoyed. Still, he and Joe Cheyenne Cadena were thick as thieves, bound by their shared brutality and a vision for La M's dominance. As Cadena was discussing a possible truce, La M sent a brutal message, stabbing 2 NF members to death. In retaliation, the NF set their sights on Cadena. One day, as he stepped out of his cell, he was met with knives and a lead pipe. He knew he was going to die that day, but hiding wasn't an option. Fearless from the start, he faced them head-on. The NF beat him mercilessly, then dragged his lifeless body to the second floor and threw him over the balcony. When he crashed to the ground, they weren't done. Men rushed in, stabbing him again and again around 50 times. At just 29 years old, Cadena was gone, but his legend had already been sealed. To many, he was a hero. To others, just another casualty of the war. A character based on him was later featured in the movie American Me, which led to La M feeling insulted about certain depictions, including Cadena's. 10 people were said to have been murdered for their part in helping the filmmakers. That might be an exaggeration, but at least 3 were killed. Still, according to the man you'll hear about next, those guys already had black marks against their names. The movie was just the final straw. In real life, for La M, this brutal slaying of Cadena was a massive disrespect. There's a rule in La M that says, if a member of La M gets harmed or killed by someone else, such as the police or another criminal gang, retaliation must be immediate and must be swift, brutal, and deadly. 31 prisoners were killed in the next year over the spat. The grudge continued for decades, taking countless lives. And with this war taking out so many men, La M was looking to sponsor new guys to make them members. Recruiting killers. If you became a member of the Mexican Mafia in prison, you almost certainly had to already have made a name for yourself on the streets. One way to do that was to show that you were naturally inclined to perform acts of extreme violence. Ramon Mundo Mendoza was one of the most prolific killers in the Mexican Mafia, who later became an informant and has been known to talk very articulately to YouTube creators with his face covered, hiding because rule number 1 of La M is a member may not be an informant. He joined La M in 1970, soon becoming a major player in the organization. The former altar boy took inspiration from the Italian Mafia's Murder Incorporated and created La M's own version, the Inner Circle. A fitting name, especially considering what we'll reveal later about ethnic cleansing within the gang. Originally, he had dreamed of becoming a soldier and fighting in Vietnam. When that didn't work out, he found another way to channel his killer instinct, honing it to perfection on the streets. At just 19 years old, he was jumped by a member of the White Fence gang. As the beating continued, a girl intervened, telling the attackers that Mendoza had a friend named David in White Fence. That was enough, and they let him go. But Mendoza wasn't about to let it slide. Bloodied and bruised, he went back to his home turf in the Estrada courts, Boyle Heights, and rallied his crew for some good old-fashioned East LA retribution, arming themselves with long metal spikes and a machete, which Mendoza grabbed immediately. They piled into a car and drove the 5 or 6 blocks to White Fence territory. If you're not familiar with East LA's gang warfare, these gangs are literally on each other's doorsteps. Crossing into another gang's territory, usually marked by graffiti, was a serious risk. As you'll see later, some gangs don't hesitate to open fire on people just for driving through their turf. Mendoza said there was a party going on at the teen center. They walked into the building and they started hacking away at fleeing gang members. Mendoza ran upstairs and the first guy he found was one of the teens that had jumped him earlier. He slashed at him with a machete, killing him. His name was Bobby Loco Lopez. He was still only a teenager. That was Mendoza's first murder. There would be many more. He later said his head was full of mixed emotions, pride and guilt, and a little bit of sorrow. Everyone had to prove themselves in these gangs. You were expected to be able to kill, but some men were better at murder than others. It was very rarely a fair fight, so more like an execution or an act of savagery. If you were built for that kind of thing, as Mendoza clearly was, once you'd done the first murder, the rest got easier, especially when your neighborhood treated you like a returning war hero. Mendoza was pulled into a bedroom, and on the bed was a Thompson machine gun. He was told that they were going to finish off the White Fence boys later on, but not today. This was ambitious. White Fence was one of the biggest and most feared gangs in East LA. Mendoza said, "Why wait? Let's go out and get them right now. Hit them when they're not ready rather than wait for a surprise attack." The guys agreed. Mendoza didn't know it right then, but he was already making a name for himself. Armed and dangerous, they drove back to White Fence territory and stopped the car near Fresno Park. There was no one to be seen. In the distance, they could still see the crime scene tape from the murder they had just committed. The White Fence boys must have been spooked, laying low, or so they thought. Then, one of Mendoza's crew spotted them, walking toward the car under the streetlights. As they got closer, Mendoza didn't hesitate. He flew out of the car, Thompson submachine gun in hand, and opened fire. bullets spraying through the night, hitting one of the men, though not fatally. Mendoza was forever known after that as Machine Gun Mundo. For him, it was a failure. He hadn't killed anyone. It wasn't a 187, the California Penal Code for murder. He later said there was no honor in causing injury, only murder counted. Sometime later, one of Mendoza's friends visited him at home, fresh from the battlefields of Vietnam. He brought his bayonet with him, proudly telling Mendoza who he had killed and how he had done it. "What war are you fighting?" he asked his friend ironically, knowing Mendoza had always wanted to fight in Nam, but was wasting his time fighting in the streets. Mendoza didn't know it right then, but the cops were already after him for the machete murder. A few minutes later, the cops kicked in his house door and arrested him. Mendoza got up to 15 years for involuntary manslaughter. Outside of the courtroom, his own mother and the mother of Bobby Lopez were weeping. They had each lost a son to the gangs. For a moment, Mendoza understood the profound emotional damage a murder causes, but it wasn't going to stop him. A year and a half later, as one of the youngest inmates in San Quentin, he was a fully fledged member of the Mexican Mafia, his new family. They'd known as soon as they saw him that he was a natural-born killer. He had the instinct, the willingness, and he showed no regret whatsoever after committing more murders in prison. He later said he committed 6 himself and helped with many more, describing this time of his life as fun. He basked in the luxury that came with his high status in prison, but when he was released in '75, he took murder to the next level, on the streets. The Mexican Mafia was still working to unite and control the scattered Latino gangs, but their mission had grown even more ruthless. They weren't just consolidating power, they were waging a brutal campaign to drive out black gangs in what was essentially an attempt at ethnic cleansing. Let's now see what happened when a gang defied the orders of the Mexican Mafia on the streets. Just saying no to La M drugs. Through Morgan, La M members still had contacts with the Mexicans in Mexico for heroin. So after buying large amounts, they installed dealers around the neighborhoods that they were trying to control. If you bought it from La M, they protected you, and they made sure your stash never ran low. But there were plenty of other street gangs, and they still had their own connections, and this was problematic. La M would find dealers and make them offers they couldn't refuse. Either buy from us or we'll kill you. If the dealer refused, there was no argument, no deliberation. They were killed there and then. It was just business. They took out so many dealers that they would drive around neighborhoods with pride, admiring their work, all of the crime scene tape. Despite the zero-tolerance nature of their business, not everyone was scared. This included a pair of brothers who were dealing for a local gang. They had bad-mouthed La M, and they were not about to start changing who they bought the heroin from. So Mendoza and his friend, Sailor, devised a plan to eliminate those targets. They used a female gangbanger, someone who one of the brothers had a crush on, as bait. She knocked on the house door as Mendoza and Sailor waited nearby. When one of the men answered and let her in, Mendoza and Sailor rushed in. They attacked him viciously, stabbing him with scissors. A slow, agonizing death. But they weren't done. They stayed inside, waiting for the other brother to return, ready to finish the job. A car pulled up outside, and inside were a man and a woman. The other brother had arrived, and within moments he was at gunpoint in a bedroom, while the woman was tied up with a sock in her mouth. Mendoza and Sailor demanded to know where the drugs, the money, and the guns were. Then the brother asked what had happened to his sibling. Mendoza smirked and told him he'll see him later. Then he pulled the trigger and shot him dead. It was the first time they'd used a female gang member in a murder. She had seen everything, so Sailor told Mendoza they should kill her. But she was the sister of a La M member from Bakersfield, so she survived. The message was clear: you don't say no to La M's drugs. Okay, so now let's talk about mass extermination. The Church of the Green Light. As time went on, the Mexican Mafia expanded its control. Major street gangs like Florencia 13 and 18th Street, despite their power, all paid the tax. In La M's world, you did what you were told. 18th Street originally started as a MacArthur Park neighborhood gang with both Latino and black members. But in the 1990s, they were given a brutal ultimatum: kick out the black members or face a green light. And in gang culture, a green light meant one thing: total extermination. They had no choice. It was adios amigos to their black brothers in arms. As a gang expert said in an interview, when you click up with a gang that's loyal to the Mexican Mafia comes before God, your family, and your friends, going all the way back to childhood. When they tell you to do something, you've got to do it. In the mid-2000s, La M put a green light out, telling its affiliated gangs to murder all African-American gangs they came across, a kind of ethnic cleansing. Everyone affiliated with La M had to follow the order. There were plenty of murders, and not always of gang members. Members of the public were caught in the crossfire. The green light order came from a high-ranking La M member named Alex Pee Wee Aguirre. He is still serving life in Marion, but was once on the streets as a member of the street gang The Avenues. In the mid-90s, he was one of 12 men indicted for killing 5 people and conspiring to murder 7 more, as well as for selling drugs and racketeering. He took over the gang as a shot caller at just 14 years old, stepping up after his brother was sent to prison. His first murder was said to be of 27-year-old Joseph Torres, an Avenues member who had made the mistake of collecting taxes for the wrong La M member. Another dealer, Alan Downey, was killed after claiming, "I don't pay rent to anybody." A black man named Eric Green was shot in the head in Pomona, killed by a young man he had grown up with, someone he had attended birthday parties with as a kid. The shooter, Frank Limon, wasn't acting on personal grudges. He was following orders. His gang had sworn allegiance to the Mexican Mafia, and that came with a directive: kill black people. And in the gang world, putting in work even against former friends was just another way to earn respect. These guys were ruthless. One night, 3 black guys, not even gang members, had just been to a popular gay bar in North Hollywood. They were driving near Avenues territory when they were spotted by 3 men carrying a .357 revolver, a 9mm semi-automatic, and a 12-gauge shotgun. All 3 men opened fire, blowing out the windows and a tire. One guy was hit in the throat, severing his carotid artery, causing him to die within minutes. An attorney later said they wanted all blacks out of the neighborhood, not just African-American men, not just African-American gang members, but all African-American women and children. There might only be about 300 hardcore members of La M, but when you include affiliations, the associates, we're talking about many thousands of men who are willing to kill for the cause. And the violence is cyclical. Not long after Eric Green was murdered, a car of black gang members pulled up in a Latino neighborhood armed with AK-47s. They unloaded on a group of people outside of their houses, none of them gang members. It didn't matter. This was about making a statement. As the 3 victims lay on the ground, screaming in pain, the gunmen showed no mercy. They walked up and fired shots into the backs of their heads, execution style. All 3 killed on the spot. They were aged 10, 17, and 22. The killer, Charles Ray Smith, a member of the Rolling 30 Pyrrhus gang, fired 38 rounds that day. He said in court he was just looking for someone to kill. As we said, this is a vicious cycle, as you'll see again and again as we go on with the show. Tax evasion. For the Mexican Mafia, one of the easiest ways to make money was by taxing local gangs and neighborhoods through intimidation. The alternative method was bloodshed, but the Lowell Street Locos chose to defy them, a high-risk move that few dared to make. When the collector, a member of the El Sereno Rifa, came to demand payment, they stood their ground. The response was simple: why pay outsiders for work they had nothing to do with? They weren't interested in paying any taxes. La M, who had never been famous for cool-headed diplomacy, put up the green light. What this meant is that all the other gangs with La M were now obligated to stab, smash, or shoot the Locos. This included the El Sereno Rifa gang, which the Locos were actually an offshoot of. Rather than pay, in 1995 the Locos shot a member of La M, and with that, they had just declared war on La M. It's believed that their rash decision may have led to their extinction, but with gangs, mythology often clouds the facts. One Reddit thread dedicated to the topic features conflicting accounts. Some claim the Lowell Street Locos survived and that only 1 member was killed. But another commenter painted a much bloodier picture, stating they lost way more than 1 person. They got bombed on from all sides: 18th Street, El Sereno, Metro, 13, killed like 6 of them dudes the moment the green light hit. Later, you'll see how another Latino gang fought back against La M for years. But first, let's look at some more interracial scraps. Tales from the Crips. It won't come as a shock that the Mexican Mafia and the Crips were far from friends. Founded in 1969, the Crips, like La M, eventually became an umbrella organization for many loosely allied gangs. But unlike the Mexican Mafia's structured contracts with gangs, Crips sets often operated independently, sometimes even clashing with each other. Still, their influence was massive. The Crips expanded to 221 U.S. cities across 41 states, with an estimated 30,000 to 35,000 members spread across 800 sets. And as most people know, they've been locked in a deadly feud with the Bloods for decades. Tensions between the Crips and La M were always simmering, but every so often they boiled over. In 2008, the Florencia 13 gang unleashed a wave of terror in the Florence Firestone neighborhood with 20 homicides and around 80 shootings. The U.S. press called it a cleansing, a targeted attack on black gangs and, in some cases, any black residents. A sheriff said the order was shoot any black you see. And they did. Gang members drove past an innocent man waiting at a bus stop. After shouting "cheese toast," a known insult toward the East Coast Crips, They opened fire on him without hesitation. The fight went to the prisons too. In 2006, the Mexican Mafia planned a massive attack at LA County jails. They wanted to show the black gangs who were dominant. For 2 whole weeks, riots broke out. Hundreds of men were injured among the 2,000 who clashed in a brutal all-out prison brawl. 2 were killed as beds were hurled from landings and inmates brawled on the tiers below. Chaos erupted as officers fired tear gas and pepper bombs, launching sting ball grenades into the melee. But the fighting raged on, with 20,000 inmates packed into county jail, 80% of them gang-affiliated, and only 5,000 staff. There was little the officers could do to stop the bloodshed. Since 1990, the jail has seen over 150 major brawls between Latinos and blacks, with the black gangs often being vastly outnumbered. That's how it was in 2009. La MA shot caller Mando Morales, a member since 1971, put a green light on black prisoners at the California Institution for Men. In a 2-day riot, 55 men were hospitalized. 50 of them were black. Morales' order was to attack indiscriminately. Gang affiliation not important. Now let's look at La MA's hardest and longest fight with a fellow Latino gang, Mayhem and Maravilla. Starting around 1993 and lasting until 2007, the Maravilla gang, which controlled around 20 neighborhoods in East LA, refused to pay taxes to La MA, much like the Lowell Street Locos. But Maravilla was different. It wasn't just a small, defiant crew, it was a force of nature. This wasn't going to be an easy extinction event for La MA and its affiliates. The green light was given, and all of the Mexican Mafia-affiliated gangs were told to shoot anyone suspected of belonging to Maravilla on sight. What ensued were numerous drive-by shootings, but the Maravilla held their own. They were tough, putting up what some familiar with the matter called a righteous fight. In fact, an academic researcher called the fight victimization perhaps unrivaled in the gang world. It was a war of attrition. Maravilla wasn't willing to bend the knee, stating its case at a meeting that's become gangland history. It took place in Belvedere Park with more than 400 men in attendance. One of them, who was there, later said, "There was no way that we were going to pay taxes to the Mexican Mafia. East LA was our territory. Nobody was going to tell us what to do here." Some of the Maravilla were actually part of the original Mexican Mafia, so it wasn't as if La MA had them quaking in their boots. Still, some of the speakers at the meeting said that there's already been too many funerals. Let's not have a war. But when taxes were brought up, the Maravilla guys refused to budge. As the war filled the streets with blood, getting sent to prison or jail for a Maravilla could be a death sentence. La MA ruled the prisons, and there was no getting around that fact. One of the Maravilla gang members later said, when he got into a shared cell in LA County Jail, someone asked him where he was from. He wasn't going to lie, so the next thing he knew, he had 5 guys beating on him. They broke his ribs and his jaw, but he believed he'd retained his self-respect. Another Maravilla member was given a grim choice by a shot caller in prison: denounce his gang, cross out his Maravilla tattoos, and he'd be allowed to live. But to him, that was unthinkable. "He wanted me to dishonor my neighborhood so that I could stay alive," he later said. He refused to bow down. When he walked into the yard, a group of men armed with shivs was waiting for him. They stabbed him 3 times, but he lived to fight another day. After a transfer, he was stabbed again, this time in the back. Somehow, he got through his sentence and ended up being interviewed for an academic paper. Another Maravilla member said, if you went to the yard or the showers and you knew what was coming, if not today, then later. And if it didn't happen and you relaxed, that's when the green light was switched on. The next thing you knew, some Sureño was trying to make a name for himself by sticking a sharpened toothbrush in your neck. But they gave as good as they got. They started, quote, cracking heads. One guy said they'd even wait outside the jail for someone to be released and give them an unholy beating. The jail soon had to make a special housing unit just for Maravillas, but they never asked for segregation, and going to PC showed weakness. So some would lie about gang affiliation and face the music in the general population. They said the fact was your loyalty should always be to your neighborhood, not to some outsiders. You stuck with the guys you grew up with, the ones who had your back. But not everyone felt that way. One of them later said that it just wasn't worth the hassle. He explained, "You're outnumbered 100 to 1. They just keep attacking you and attacking you. Sure, you might have heart, but when the knife comes for you, in a fight that's anything but fair, you might start to wonder what matters more, honor or existence." Still, no one told that to the Opal Street Locos, a late Sureño's extinction event. These days, if a Sureño gang disappears, it's likely due to gentrification wiping out their old stomping grounds. But back in the day, refusing to pay La MA's tax didn't just put your gang at risk, it put you at risk of disappearing from the face of the earth. In the 1990s, the Opal Street Locos, a gang out of Boyle Heights, boldly defied La M by using the Roman numeral 15 or FG15. This was a direct result to MA-loyal gangs who repped the number 13. It sent a clear message: we are not your slaves, we don't pay tax. This very brave or reckless decision had OSL declaring war on all Serrano gangs, reportedly taking a particular dislike to the Indiana Jukes, White Fence, and Barrio Nuevo Estrada. The latter was notorious for drive-by shootings, over the years expanding into new territories. White Fence is one of Los Angeles' oldest, most respected gangs, with roots dating back to the 1920s. Among its most notorious members was Ernest Kilroy Roble, one of the first recruits into La M back in 1961. For decades, White Fence terrorized the streets of LA, claiming to be the first gang to commit a drive-by shooting in LA history. Put it this way, if you ever find yourself walking down Death Alley in White Fence territory, there's a good chance you won't be coming back. And the OSL was going against all of these gangs, green lights flashing in their heads every time they left the house. And just as it was for the men of Maravilla, a short jail or prison sentence could easily turn into a death sentence. They were present at the now famous meeting on September 18, 1992, when 2,000 gang members gathered at Elysian Park. The only rule was no violence. Don't come armed. A member of the OSL clearly hadn't read the memo. He showed up with a pistol in his pocket. Ernest Chuco Castro, one of La M's top enforcers at the time, a ruthless killer turned future informant, didn't take that lightly. He slapped the OSL member across the face in front of everyone, and after that, the beef was official. It is worth noting that La M sometimes tried to reduce the rate of violence in the streets, hoping to put some order into the chaos. Chaos isn't usually good for profits because the public will demand the police make mass arrests. At that meeting, they told the gangs to either quit doing drive-by shootings or face the wrath of a green light order. So, in fact, it was like a peace treaty but with La M setting all the rules. But the OSL guy who got a face slapping wasn't too happy. It's hard to know exactly what went down, but it seems OSL wasn't playing ball and a green light was put on them. While the treaty did reduce the murder rate, OSL was hunted down. Unlike the Maravilla, they were a fairly small gang, so you would think that they'd have been wiped out without much of a problem. But one notable incident took place at a house party on July 4, 2009. A young man named Pete Sochipa was shot in the head and killed, and the perpetrators, Julio and Francisco Flores, were OSL. So, the gang did survive, but like with the Maravilla, the green light against them was probably dropped years ago. They either paid up, temporarily disbanded, or became too small in numbers. But these guys were tough. Just as someone wrote online, Maravilla, Opal, and Lowell embraced the green light. Every other gang does whatever it takes to remove it. But in the end, everyone pays. You might see yourself as a natural-born vato loco, but if you refuse to pay your taxes, sooner or later the streets will catch up to you. And when they do, it's highly likely your name will end up sprayed on a wall, right next to the letters RIP, a familiar signature in the barrios of East LA. What do you think? Were these gangs brave for standing up to La M, or was defying the Mexican Mafia a death sentence from the start? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out You Won't Believe How El Chapo Escaped Prison Twice, or have a look at How the Great Mafia War Killed Thousands.